This video will give you a few hints and tips about how to answer questions in GCSE Edexcel History Paper 1. The example that we're looking at is Crime and Punishment in Britain, and that's with Whitechapel. Remember, you need to answer most of the questions on this paper. The last two, you need to pick question 5 and 6. And this example that I'm using is from 2021. And the total marks on that occasion was 48. However, it's normally 52. And the reason for that is the exam board lost the 4 spag marks. So they took them away because of the whole COVID situation. So this is what every single question on the exam paper looks like. I've copied and pasted it. So the first 3 are on Whitechapel and the next 3 are on Crime and Punishment. However, it's important to look at the amount of marks they're worth. So this one is 4, 8 and 4. So that's 16 marks for Whitechapel, and it goes 4, 12 and 16. So that's 32 marks for Crime and Punishment. So the majority of your marks for this paper will come from Crime and Punishment, but that isn't to say that the Whitechapel section isn't worth revising or isn't worth answering. So the first question, and this is a Whitechapel based question because the first 3 are Whitechapel, is describe 2 features of, and it could give you anything on the specification. So you need to identify that first feature and then give an additional detail. So the exam paper looks like this, and just be really clear to write your first feature here and your second feature here. Don't start writing a bit of your second feature here and go in here. Just be really clear, make it easier for your examiner. So again, the example I'm using is from November 2021, and on that occasion the question was describe 2 features of lodging houses in Whitechapel, and here's my answer. So the first feature is that lodging houses provided a cheap place to sleep, 1 mark. Whitechapel was an area with many poor people and there was an increasing demand for this type of establishment, another mark. The second feature is that conditions in the lodging houses were poor. As men slept in 8-hour shifts and the areas were not cleaned, they become unhygienic extremely quickly. So 2 marks for that, 2 marks for that, that's 4 marks. And if we have a look at the mark scheme, there's loads of just different types of things I could have written. So I could have said it's for transient individuals, which means that individuals come and go for the area. I could have said the owners tried to maximise their profits. I could have said it's overcrowded, but I've got my 4 marks. I'm going to move on. For this type of question, you either know it or you don't. You just need to get down the answer to the question and then move on as quickly as possible. The second question is a bit more complicated. Sources are involved. So the question will always say, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into? And then it will give you something always named from the specification. So for this question, even though source A and source B contrast each other, there's no reason to compare and contrast each other. Almost treat it like 2 separate questions, one for source A and one for source B. So for source A, you need to make a comment on the content, what you see in the source, and then does that match up with your own knowledge, and then link it back to the provenance, so the nature, origin and purpose. And then once you've done those 2 things, answer the question. So how useful is it for that inquiry? So by content, I mean what inferences can you make from that source? Does it match up with your own knowledge? By nature, I mean what is the source? Is it a cartoon? Is it a newspaper? Is it a diary entry? And how does that affect how useful it is, how reliable it is? The origin, where did that source come from? And again, how does that affect reliability? So if it's a newspaper, is it a local newspaper? Is it a national newspaper? Is it a left-wing? Is it a right-wing newspaper? All these things are really important. And then the purpose of the source is why was that source made? And once you've done these 3 things, you need to make a comment on that reliability, and how does that reliability impact the utility, the usefulness for that inquiry. So this is an example from 2021. So how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your knowledge of the historical content. So again, remember, we don't need to compare and contrast them, even though they're clearly different. So source A is a cartoon. And this is what I mean by content. So here's a policeman. And by the way, policeman is the correct phrase here. 19th century, females were not allowed to be police officers. So when we refer to policemen, we're saying policemen or policemen. So here's a policeman. He's got something covering his face. At the bottom, it says blind man's buff. I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pretty dodgy looking people around the policeman. One looks like he's ripping something off. It could be a wanted poster, and the area looks pretty unkept. And then does that match up with my own knowledge? We'll talk about how literally we should take this in a moment when we go through the question. And then the provenance there says, a cartoon published in Punch magazine on the 22nd of September 1888. So I know that's when Jack the Ripper was active. The title Blind Man's Buff refers to a children's game where one person is blindfolded and tries to catch the others. So here's an example for my answer. These are the things I need to include in my answer. I've colour coded them to try and make this clearer for you. So the content. The cartoon of a single policeman blindfolded, surrounded by multiple criminals in Whitechapel, now I've gone on to my own knowledge, is a representation of the lack of policemen in the H Division. And remember, H Division was the division in which the police sat in Whitechapel. So there was A to Z's division in the Metropolitan Police Force. H Division was Whitechapel. Whitechapel was an area of high crime, and there was around 1 policeman per 300 people. Clear own knowledge there. Again, I've reiterated some of the content. The blindfold could represent the police's efforts to catch Jack the Ripper were not effective. Own knowledge, this is likely to have been because they were not trained effectively. As the source is a cartoon from Punch magazine in 1888, many of the details are likely to have been exaggerated to make the source comical to its audience. And up there, comical to its audience, that's purpose. Now I'm going to say, is it reliable? Therefore, while the cartoon is reliable in its representation of police and challenges, it should not be taken literally. And now I need to link everything back to the question. So in conclusion, source A is useful to highlight the lack of policing and training of policemen in the late 19th century, and this explains the reasons the police could not catch Jack the Ripper. So I've linked it back to that inquiry. So I've said the inquiry, remember, was the failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper. I've gone over the content, my own knowledge, I've included the provenance, and now I've linked it back to the question. So let's have a look at source B, because I need to do it for source B, the exact same thing. So source B is from the East London Advertiser on the 15th of September 1888, slightly before this one. Here the newspaper is commenting on the actions of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, during the Ripper murders. Remember, the Commissioner was the most senior police officer. Sir Charles Warren has made several mistakes that can endanger the community. He has increased the number of ordinary constables in the police force. However, there are now fewer specially trained detectives who would have brought a higher intelligence and specialised knowledge to the investigation into the Whitechapel murders. Also, the men he has added to the police force have a military background and lack any policing experience or local knowledge. The hunt for the Whitechapel murderer has shown that these men seem to know little about the bad areas in the neighbourhood. They know even less about the bad characters who live there. So, remember that the inquiry is the failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper. So what does this tell us about the failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper? So here's my answer. B, I'm going through the same thing. So, the newspaper article puts blame for the Jack the Ripper's escape on Sir Charles Warren because the police officers are not properly trained and lack local knowledge. I've learnt that from the content by reading the source. I'm now going to add my own knowledge to this. From my own knowledge, and that there tells the examiner really clearly that now I'm using my own knowledge, give me marks for it. This is largely accurate. Police recruits come from outside London because they were thought to be healthier than city dwellers. Whitechapel was a densely populated area with narrow streets. The criminals often knew the area better than the policemen. As the source is an extract from the East London Advertiser, the origin, the audience, the purpose now I'm going through, the audience is only the people that lived in East London, as it would not be sold anywhere else. Therefore, it is likely to have been made in response to the frustrations of local people had with the police. Therefore, the source is reliable for highlighting what local people thought at the time. They wanted someone to blame. In conclusion, source B is useful as it highlights that the local police were not able to catch Jack the Ripper because policemen were inexperienced and did not understand the local area because they lived outside of it. So now I've linked everything back to that inquiry. So the inquiry was the failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper. The mark scheme's really, really clear. So judgments on source utility, how useful the sources are, need to be based on the specified inquiry. So our specified inquiry that we've just gone to was the failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper. And it needs to take into account the provenance. And it's really clear what provenance means: the nature, origin and purpose. What was it? Where did it come from? Why was it made? And then how does that provenance affect its usefulness? So in source B, we said it affects its usefulness because we shouldn't take it literally. And then I need to add contextual knowledge, and for both of those sources I did it. So I think if this was an answer, the examiner would look down the levels and say it's definitely level 3. Would I give this 6, 7 or 8 marks? It'll be 8 marks, and that's how examiners work. The next question is study source, and it will say A and B, the exact same two sources that you've just gone through. So this question should be really quick. How could you follow up source? And it will say A or B to find out more about, and it will give you something like a question. So we'll look at November 2021 just to keep it consistent. So the question then was, how could you follow up source B to find out more about the failure of the police to catch Jack the Ripper? In your answer, you must give the question you would ask and the type of source you can use. Complete the table below, and the table looks like this. Detailing source B you'd follow up, question you'd ask, type of source you could use, and how this helps answer your question. So this is my example. So what I would follow up: these men seem to know little about the bad areas in the neighbourhood. They know even less about the bad characters who live there. So I've quoted something. I've got a mark just for quoting something. The question that I would ask is, did these new policemen have any impact on the police's attempts to catch Jack the Ripper? Good question. The type of source I would use is records from H Division showing what work was done by individual policemen. And how would this help you answer the question is I would know how the extra police were used and what impact they had on finding Jack the Ripper. And again, the mark scheme is pretty similar to the first question. It gives examiners examples of things that people could say. The examiner's report is much more interesting. So the broad inquiry in the question, in this case it was to catch Jack the Ripper, it's got to be focused on that. The question needs to be focused on that. So the question I asked is, did these policemen have any impact on the police's attempt to catch Jack the Ripper? It's got to relate back to that, and the source needs to be as precise as possible. So probably this source I might not get a mark for it because I've just put records from H Division. I might have been able to put individual police officers' notebooks or handbooks, that the things they carried around with them to take notes. I might have said that instead. And then it should be specific about the type of information the source could provide. So what information am I looking for in that source?